Hello to everyone who is joining us today for the last in a four-part series about EagleApps and our community webinar series. Today we'll focus on the formation of the community and the implementation studies and the detail around that, and move through with your increased understanding of both EagleApps and our community and our interests. Some logistics, like we've talked about each time, but just to make sure people are aware. So all of these will be, recordings are available on the EagleApps site off of DXtera. If you have a question during it, and we do want questions in any chat that we can have, please go ahead and post it in the question and answer. A member of the team will respond either live during the session or via text, or we'll save it to the end for the additional question and answers. You can also place any comments right in the chat function, and you can raise your hand as well. The first two are probably easier to do. And again, as we talk through each one of these sessions that we've done, it's been very helpful to us to gather any questions that come in to help us start to understand and share kind of frequently asked questions and that sort of thing. Our presenters for today are folks that you have mostly met before during this series, but Mike Burke from Boston College, myself, DXtera, Jeff Merriman, and Amun Horn, and Tom Capetto, who is both with Boston College and DXtera. And we want to start with, we'll break it up a little bit, but they link together in that the interest and goal is to form a community of colleagues and peers to bring forward EagleApps into the marketplace in a collective way with advice and guidance and input. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll move into the more detailed aspects of the implementation studies and what that will be. So with that, I'd like to introduce my counterpart, Mike Burke from Boston College.
Thank you, Dale. Hello, folks. Thank you once again for taking your time from your busy schedules during crazy times to join with DXtera and Boston College as we discuss our efforts here in what we're calling EagleApps. So once again, my name is Mike Burke, and I'm the Vice President of Information Technology here at Boston College. I've been involved with this project for many years. We hope you've been able to have the benefit of the prior webinars where you've had a variety of folks from a functional perspective or a technical perspective, go through in pretty good breadth and a little bit of depth to give you a taste of what's possible with EagleApps in terms of its functional capabilities and technical capabilities. We're very proud of what we've got, and we're very proud of what we've been able to show. We want to, be upfront and be clear. This is not the product of Boston College's sole invention here. This is the product of a community that was once called the Kowali Student System Project, a community of like-minded institutions, approximately 25 schools. So the sum here is greater than just the addition of the parts, right? So it comes together. There's some synergy, and the input reflects the input of very wide variety of schools, from small to very large, to US based and non-US based. And it's the product of those schools, and we think it's far beyond what Boston College would have been capable of building on its own. So it reflects the benefit of a community. And we got into a situation where we needed to advance what we had in terms of our system. So we needed to go fast, and we needed to develop this application to get it where it is. We've made considerable investment of time and resources to get it to where it is today, built on those original models, designs, and contributions. And we're really proud of it. We think it fits our vision of a system that can be modular, can be implemented in an incremental fashion, is very extensible for the future, and avoids vendor lock-in. It's the non-monolithic approach to doing a student system, right? Where you can integrate with very easily with best-of-breed systems, and it fits varying sizes, right? So we think there's a lot to be had here, but we also recognize that as a single university, we may not be able to give it the care and feeding and the stewardship that it needs for the long term to really benefit the broader community beyond Boston College in the way it could. And we think if we could build a community of like-minded institutions, we could develop a model, a practice of that would allow us to continue to develop, to maintain, to support, and extend a system of systems here, if you will, and to be able to, by doing so, help each other by utilizing perhaps shared code, perhaps shared integration, perhaps shared training materials and implementation documentation and approaches, and share in further enhancement and future extensions to the system. We partnership with third-party vendors. So there's a bunch of ways that we foresee this system with a very impressive foundation being able to be maintained and extended for the foreseeable future. And we think we can and will do that if we're the only school to do it, but we think it has far, far greater capacity and potential if we can build a community of like-minded schools and, as Dale said, bring this to the market in some form that benefits the community. So with that, that's the general game plan. You know, I think I quoted on the first webinar, I like this quote from Nelson Mandela: if you want to go fast, go alone. And that's what we needed to do. But if you want to go far, go together. And that's what we need to do now. So we went fast to get it to this position, and now we want to position it for the long term, for the long run, to be able to grow and extend and reap the benefits of it. So we welcome you, and we welcome your interest in participating in a community, and we hope you enjoyed today's overview and look forward to talking to you more in the future. And if you have any questions, please follow up at any time.
Great, thank you, Mike. And again, it's been a amazing opportunity to collaborate with Boston College and the team, with DXtera and our growing nonprofit consortium of colleges, universities, and partners around the world who are interested in creating next generation education systems and reducing the friction to use to do integration solutions at a larger scale. And so it's been really a great opportunity, but I wanted to make sure I reference, as we think about a community and inform you about this with the priorities that Mike just mentioned. We have kind of a model method that we follow at DXtera as a growing collaborative organization. Most of what we do is kind of follows this model. And we've been following this process here with these webinar series, in that we have been providing the opportunity for you to explore a product, an offering, EagleApps, to see if it's something that may address some challenges, needs, and interest in a vision for your own future. Through the first series we've been doing in discussions over the last few months with institutions around Europe and the US. The second piece of our model is always about engagement. We want people to be actively engaged and proving or designing, developing, deploying solutions and opportunities that make sense for them and for our community and market. We ask everyone to invest. We're a membership organization that lowers the barrier to entry in many ways, both in technology and investing in solutions, and we share those solutions collectively whenever possible. The fourth item is about improving the circumstances for yourself, but also for others, as Mike just noted. And the last is that we look to share. How can we share our learnings, best practices through a community of practice out to the marketplace, beyond the community itself, but also start to shift and change the market. Part of what Mike noted, and I just want to go into a little bit more detail, what we're inviting folks to join into is to be engaged in a community that really has regular interaction, where we have a kind of a monthly interaction that is designed by the members of the community, supported by the DXtera team, and facilitated by members within that community or the DXtera staff or Boston College. where we are focused on, what are the right kind of forums, unique forums and opportunities to help you with your own circumstances and challenges, to gather more information, and to increase your knowledge of what is possible, or what is necessary for your own circumstance, and maybe EagleApps applies. We envisioned pre-COVID regular in-person gatherings, and I guess I was longing for in-person when I put this in, just that, it would be great to actually get together with people and have these conversations again and get deep into the details and the thinking, and understand that we have many similarities among our different institutional members and partners, but getting the chance to talk about these and engage regularly. And so we'll do those both virtually and in person when we may be able, and other seminars that relate to this topic that will be open to this community only. Thirdly, you'll hear the significantly more detail on the implementation studies here in a moment, but the outputs from that, the outputs that we start to get from the learnings and really form a community practice and get input and guidance and feedback on what we're learning from these schools, and thinking about what might be necessary. And that includes from the documentation you'll hear all the way through every aspect of this. So, and lastly, and maybe the most important, as Mike said, by doing this as a collective community, one of the things is Boston College is really looking for kind of advisory council to serve in a leadership role to help really guide and think about the development roadmap. What is necessary for maintenance? What kind of training and support services may be required for institutions and users? And those in the community get to drive that with us and meet your own needs as we're, again, expanding to grow out into something into the marketplace. And the last section is really about what is the best model to take what EagleApps is at Boston College and scale its availability and application or use out in the marketplace for interested community members, and then a growing collective of institutions, ideally, and other business partners, application partners who want to have a best in breed product that they want to link in with this. And so getting ideas, we have a lot of ideas already and thoughts on what the business model could be, should be, licensing and how that could be delivered, and how could, again, how can this product be shared with a community, and then maybe made available in different ways out beyond that. And again, what's the best model for implementation and what is necessary to support that, which is really the primary goal behind the implementation studies. And so that's really our request to you is we want you to be involved in a forming community, to be a active member who can help on these aspects, and I'm sure more to come, but to do that through a regularly structured and supported environment that provides you access to information, but also answers your own questions as you move forward. With that, I'd like to turn the presentation off to our next segment, which will be about the implementation studies. And this will be led by, or started by, Jeff Merriman, my colleague, Chief Technology Officer at DXtera, and then followed by Tom Capetto, Senior Architect at Boston College and DXtera, and Amun Horn, who is a Technical Program Manager at DXtera. So with that, I will stop sharing, and I will turn it over to you, Jeff.
Okay. Let me share.
We can see your screen. And we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. We're excited to talk about the implementation studies today. And again, you can be part of the EagleApps community without having to be part of an implementation study. As you're going to see as we move forward, the implementation studies are really designed to be very in-depth engagements from organizations who are considering whether EagleApps is the right solution for them, and ready to move forward on a process to plan for that. So the implementation studies really are kind of, it deals with two sides of a coin, as it were. There's two goals of the implementation studies for us, and we think for the EagleApps community. For organizations participating in the study, and we're going to really get into this in detail, it's develop an organizational understanding of EagleApps. Some of you have been listening into these various sessions. Maybe you're thinking about getting deeper with EagleApps and finding out what it means for your organization. That's a part of what the study is all about. But it's also about creating an actual implementation plan based on the requirements and processes of the particular organization. And we're going to get into a lot of detail about that. So for the organization, there is a deliverable, and you'll find out about that. But for the community, it's really about developing more and more resources and opportunities around EagleApps. So Boston College has done an amazing job in bringing EagleApps to where it is. It's a very rich, very deep system that they've been developing, but there's a lot of things that it currently doesn't come with that the community would need. Best practices for how to deploy and use EagleApps, growing documentation around EagleApps, implementation information that can be shared, and really, doing this through a set of planning processes and templates. So everything you're going to hear about today is information that will be made available to the community as we create these documents. Obviously, we'll be sharing private information, sensitive information about institutions in the study, but the general models and practices and templates and documentation and best practices that come out of the study will be shared with the community. So it's really serving a couple of purposes here. So what is the implementation study? Well, again, it's an opportunity for an organization to institutionally walk through the EagleApps model and understand what it means for that organization. It's focused with members of that institution or college, really in depth, looking at EagleApps, understanding EagleApps, examining the models, and understanding how those models support specific processes at a particular institution. I think one thing you've hopefully learned over the last few sessions is EagleApps is extremely flexible, and it can be designed and tuned and configured to meet the needs of various kinds of processes that that institutions have. We're all different. All of our organizations are different in how they deliver educational experiences, how they manage educational processes and administrative processes. And this will be designed as part of the implementation study. And then what will come out of it, as I already mentioned, is a plan, a documented plan for how to implement EagleApps at the institution being studied. And we're about to get into the details of that. So a study leads to a plan. The plan, the document, the artifacts that will come out of the study for a particular institution, and many of these to be then shared as we learn more and more with the growing community, is really touches on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points. I hadn't counted them before. So starting with describing the processes specific to an institution, understanding how to configure and set up EagleApps and documenting that and customize EagleApps for a particular institution. What are the integrations needed for the institution? Any additional applications and tools that might be required. What does a deployment plan look like incrementally? And I think that's one thing we've talked about a lot in these sessions is incremental deployment is a key piece of EagleApps. We're going to talk about that. We think it mitigates a lot of the risk of rolling out a system like this. What's the plan for operations and training? And finally, looking at what the resource and budget plan would be for an organization to move forward over a period of time to incrementally deploy EagleApps. So this is really the outcome of a study tuned for an institution, but again, the learnings of which become templates and general general artifacts and documentation and best practices that become available to the community at large. So we're going to start looking through each of these 8 points, starting with processes. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom Capetto. I'll still drive the slides, so Tom might have to cue me once in a while.
Well, hello. So EagleApps is a very large system. It is an ERP class system. And so as such, there are many aspects to it that can be configured, customized, supplemented and so forth to bring it into your home institution. So I was asked, well, give some examples of processes in EagleApps. And a few weeks ago, we talked about the course life cycle, from creating course curriculum to offering those courses in a term, registration, and eventually grading and roll up to the academic record. And these are sort of very high-level concepts, and I think anyone who's been around student systems, this really shouldn't look that alien. But let's take a little closer look. Next slide, Jeff. Jeff?
Sorry, I'm having trouble going to the next slide. There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay. So I'm just zooming in on the arrow between course offering and course registration. And now go to the next slide. And it will feel like peeling the onion when we think about all of the things that need to be in place to get courses ready for a term and to prepare yourself for opening of registration. Capacity planning and figuring out how many sections you will need, who will be teaching them, ultimately managing your pools of instructors, scheduling them, if you have physical rooms, room scheduling, understanding in more complex courses that maybe what lectures go with what discussion groups or lab sections and how they combined and what will constitute a valid student registration within the credit and grading options available. Setting up and scheduling of final exams. If you do prioritization via registration appointments, then those appointment windows need to be configured, and students will need to be assigned to their appointment slots. And then, of course, reviewing and understanding, what kind of checks will allow or disallow a student from registering in a certain course offering in a given term. And so there is a lot of little pieces to think about when we just talk about the process of getting a term ready and opening registration. Next slide. And some of them are, in order to make this process go, we need our curriculum management for courses and exams if you'll be using EagleApps for final exams. We'll need to have the terms set up with their milestones and dates and registration windows and registration close and so forth. As with everything in EagleApps, types and states on just about every object will need to be understood. Setting up the available grades in the Learning Result Catalog service. Doing scheduling will first involve setting up standardized time slots. And then depending on your scheduling process, either setting up and configuring scheduling or integrating with an external scheduling system, understanding where you're getting your instructors from. Of course, a lot of that will eventually include integration with your campus identity management system. May also understand what instructors belong to which departments, and that gets us into the organizational hierarchy setup, and then the various other rules that are used in the registration process. Now go to the next slide. So this is a little subway diagram. It was sort of inspired by Francesca at UOC. So whenever we try to think of our processes at a high level, we notice that they interconnect in various ways. So we thought, since Barcelona has a fairly rich subway map, that we will try to do a Barcelona-like subway map to look at EagleApps from beginning to end. It also means that when we kind of shake one end of it, that it will have implications through the entire system. And so what's going to be required is understanding the overarching processes at a high level, and then to understand how they're going to interact. But then as we dig in to each little bit, there's going to be that there'll be available configurations out of the box that will be able to be tweaked, or opening up the opportunity for more extensive customizations. The distinction I make really has to do with out of the box, click in a user interface and set something versus actually doing something that impacts the code base. All right, next slide. All right. So let's get a little more into configuration. So in that more complex course offering process diagram, many of those services, whether we're managing seat pools or managing populations or managing types, these are all independently managed in their own services. User interfaces can interact with those services, and Boston College has produced many of them. But that kind of setup enables other services which depend on them to do their job. The most basic example of that is we cannot have a course offering until we have curriculum defined. Right? So defining the curriculum is not an end unto itself if you're going to bring in the course offering and course registration modules. So you have to know the impact that you may be having downstream. And whatever you're doing in course offering and course registration is ultimately going to affect perhaps your degree audit and your transcripts downstream from there. So it's all one interconnected system, even though we break it up into a set of interoperable services. So configuration is a very broad word, and it's not just walking through a set of UIs or setting up a wizard screen to say, ask you a bunch of questions or set a bunch of configuration parameters. Instead, it's understanding a particular process. It may be program enrollment, it may be course registration. Looking at what is needed, and this is what the implementation study will do on a case-by-case basis, looking at the data, the services, and the configurations available, and kind of iterating around that until you come up with a solution that fits at your institution. So for example, if you have course offerings, you need schedules before registration opens. So then you're going to ask yourself, how did those schedules get there? What constitutes a schedule? And if you have a physical campus, that involves building and rooms, and a way to standardize time slots so people don't schedule classes at 3:42 a.m. If you look at your room inventory, you'll notice that some rooms may be labs, some rooms may be classrooms, and some rooms may be janitor closets. Some rooms may be closed for renovation. So here is where you'll be thinking about types and states around buildings to inform what is possible or permissible at scheduling time, or at the very least, be able to offer warnings that maybe something is scheduled in a place that it shouldn't be. Okay, so next slide. And once again, I bring this up that this can't easily be broken up in such that we're going to have maybe one person who's a specialist in just programs, and another person who's just a specialist in room scheduling, and another person who's a specialist in transcripts, and not worry about the interconnections and the interplay between these processes. So we do need a very detailed view in this implementation study that one is familiar enough with the current practices and how that plays out in the EagleApps world, but also a broad view so that we also understand that every activity that we're doing around this subway map is going to be, wiggling the track downstream, so to speak. And to see how that's going to play out. And that could work to your advantage because you can do some very interesting leverages and automations by pushing more of the setup and more of the data entry to the beginning of the line. But it also means that there's a risk that setting up programs and requirements a certain way may make it very difficult to do graduation clearance later. Next slide. So other kinds of configurations, I've talked about the types and metadata. Types are throughout EagleApps, and types give an opportunity to kind of understand how objects and fields will be presented and how that data can be constrained. What we call experiences, that there are, we want to have a set of applications, but different roles for people around your university. They may be interested in different sets of applications or organized a different way. So we try to keep our applications, very individual, that are separate, not one big bundle and one gigantic application deployment, but things that can be moved around, and that can be done through a menuing system. Branding issues on the UIs, color schemes, CSS style sheets, logos. And one topic we didn't really spend a lot of time on, but of course, authorizations and configuring the authorization service with the right information, just so that only people who are authorized to make a change that impacts the academic record or view a student, that all of those authorizations are configured, and that'll come back to your organizational design, your organizational hierarchy, and understanding the different types of job positions that people have. And then the services themselves also have a lot of configurable items, some of them. If there is a dependency on a remote service or server, that can be configured, configuring your database technology for data persistence, and also how services relate to each other, what those stacks of services are. So next slide. And that brings me into customizations, where we're getting now more into playing with the code base a little bit. So let me just start with one example. I just drew a rectangle around the program service. This is a service that is used to, create and update, delete, manage programs. Next slide. Okay. All of our services are defined using a service contract. Our service contracts look a lot like Java APIs, because what the service contract is designed to do is to bind a service consumer and a service provider in software. And so it's that service contract that is defining the interoperability between two pieces of software in the middle. And so this is really an essential part of our architecture. So next slide. I can take the same service contract and make it usable by the first service implementation to call another service implementation, which also implements the program service. So what do I have here right now is I have two implementations of the same service contract, and one is making use of the other. So next slide. And what I can do here is I can now take something that is more complex and break it down to a separate list of concerns, whereas in each layer, I solve one problem. And for example, in the bottommost layer there, you'll see program service persistence. We use JDBC as a technology to connect to a database, and that just handles just the SQL connection and the serialization of the deserialization of that data into our service entities. If I want to perform some kind of validation, whether based on metadata or based on something custom, we put that in its own implementation. So that has its own layer. And I may have another layer that is responsible for monitoring changes, perhaps when new programs are created or programs are changed, that we want to notify something else that change occurred so they can react to it asynchronously, and perhaps through some kind of queuing system. Authorizations, they're complex enough. We don't need that scattered in the code when we're talking to the database or anything else. We put our authorizations or authorization rules into its own layer. And we may want to put something on the top to help us understand performance in the services. So next slide. These are configured. So I can, through editing a file, I could remove one of them and get them out of the way and not use it. Next slide. And then I could substitute it with something else. So in this case, in this example, I replaced the authorization layer with another implementation of that, because perhaps I want to authorize based on different types of programs rather than the organization who created it, hypothetically. So this is a very important and I think powerful part of the whole customization world in EagleApps, that we can replace a specific implementation of something that implements one concern. And that doesn't even need to be in the EagleApps source tree. I can do that in my own source tree, and then just assemble the ultimate service configuration and say, well, we'll use the out-of-the-box EagleApps service implementations for these things, but replace these two and use mine for these other two. And so that's a way that we can customize the behavior of the infrastructure in EagleApps. And next slide. So if I can replace the authorization layer, then maybe I can replace the persistence layer. And why might I want to do that? I might want to do that because I actually don't have a database or even a disk drive to access data from. And one of the examples where that holds true is if I'm integrating with an external system. And so I think with that, I will hand it back to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Tom. I'm going to pick up on sort of what Tom has started here, and do a little EagleApps service architecture refresher. He already sort of started this. This is some imagery we used in the session way back in March to sort of give a sense of the breadth and depth of EagleApps. And Tom already sort of talked about some of these graphics, right? So using these dotted lines to indicate contracts, for instance. He just went into detail on what a service stack might look like in a program program service deployment, right? So there's a lot of detail to any of these boxes here, and I'll sort of talk a little bit more about that. And you can only draw so much on a screen. I want to make sure people remember that that sort of Tetris diagram, the multiple block, multiple color diagram we've been using in some of these sessions. There are a lot of service areas that have been defined in EagleApps and implemented. So in this diagram, we're talking about applications that talk through service contracts to underlying service implementations. And as Tom just indicated, those implementations themselves might be stacked services to layer in various kinds of business logic into the whole scheme. And those apps could be talking to any number of those 70 plus or 80 plus, I guess, underlying service areas. So zooming in a little bit, abstractly, this is kind of what these things look like on this particular diagram. An application talking to contracts, maybe this application is talking to two different ones, and I've just made up, abstract service area 1, service area 2. It could be program and program offering. It could be any number of things from the multitude of services that have been defined. But just something to say about the application space. When we're building applications, EagleApps applications, or even the applications we build within DXtera's own service-based infrastructure, the applications become fairly complex things. And a lot of people ask us about REST. They ask us about software interfaces. How do they relate to each other? Why do we use one for one purpose, another for another purpose? I just wanted to tease out a little of that here. In EagleApps and in the DXtera integration framework, which has a very a fairly similar sort of architectural model to EagleApps. We're actually using the software interfaces, software contracts, in this case, Java interfaces, as the primary integration point. It's the place where you can actually write software that can plug together. We do not use protocols as a primary integration point. And REST, even though a lot of people talk about REST APIs, the REST technologies really define over-the-wire protocols primarily. And there's a number of reasons why we consider the Java interface as the primary integration point, where I say the programming language interface. We can not so much in EagleApps perhaps, but in the work we're doing in DXtera, we can also potentially be binding these things to other programming languages. But at the programming language interface level, we get to do a lot of fun tricks to do things like Tom was just showing, to stack services together. We get to make very, very clean separations between application code and backend service code. And then for things like how we might optimize application access to those backend services over a serialized wire, like an internet connection, right? That becomes part of the application space. So we end up doing a lot of things where we will be in EagleApps and also in DXtera space, where we're designing protocols, and typically REST these days, because that's what developers like to use. That's what our UI developers who are doing work with JavaScript are sort of used to dealing with these days. We can do a lot of work to optimize for performance and other things over the internet that we don't worry about as much when we're talking about plugging two pieces of software together. So EagleApps, as we move forward with the community and as we start doing deeper discussions and workshops around the APIs and around the service contracts, we will be talking about the Java contracts themselves. We will be talking about the REST expressions of those contracts and how those are often then designed to meet the needs of particular kinds of user applications. So just to note that when we show applications in the boxes, those also tend to start getting split out into multiple technology layers. And then similarly, when we talk about integration, and this is getting a little bit to the sort of thing that Tom was just talking about, if we think about implementing implementing one of these interfaces to integrate with some sort of existing product that's outside of the EagleApps code base, that also is often done through some sort of product-specific integration protocol. The product is probably living elsewhere on the internet, and it exposes its own protocol. So oftentimes what we do then is build particular product-specific connectors that also are built to the EagleApps interfaces to make that happen. And that, today these are often REST protocols. It could be WSDL, it could be web services, they could be any number of things. It could be direct database SQL calls even. So lots of detail to how these things are put together. So the first thing to talk about is sort of applications. As an organization is doing an implementation study, it may very well be, so BC is building a lot of applications, and you've seen a lot of them. You haven't seen all of them, but many applications are being built to provide user tools to deal with all the various processes and data elements and services going on underneath the covers. It's likely that 80–90% of the BC built applications will be usable and valuable in other institutions, but it is also likely that as we're doing, I'm sorry, my apologies. I have a let me go on. I put a slide in the wrong place here. This is actually my integration story. So I will get to the application story in a second. Let me just back up on that. in various institutions, as you're deploying EagleApps, you will be worried about integration with other sort of systems. And in fact, we saw an example of an integration in session 2 a couple of weeks ago, where EagleApps, where Boston College has decided they want to use the activity open source workflow engine for workflow. EagleApps defines a workflow API, but they have implemented that API against activities own, and I don't know what it is. Somebody else can probably tell me. I assume they expose some sort of RESTful endpoint to that, or maybe they expose a Java interface. I don't know, but the EagleApps team developed a implementation to that using the EagleApps workflow API. So it could be that another school looking at EagleApps has a different technology they want to use for managing workflow, and that would be the integration that would need to be specified as part of an implementation study. Similarly, we can do consumer-side integration. And what I'll point out, in DXtera itself, we have an operational data store and data warehouse product, set of products that we've been developing along with the Community College System of New Hampshire and the University of Hawaii. That system is also built strictly to sort of an API level of integration. It needs to consume information from underlying services. And one of the things we are planning to do as part of our EagleApps community activities is begin to integrate the operational data store and data warehouse with EagleApps, so it can become a robust reporting solution for people implementing EagleApps. Right now, the schools that are using this tool are Lucy and Banner schools, and this is integrated with that environment as well. We will be doing some sessions over the next few months to help people understand more about this product, and we want to do some of those sessions in particular with the EagleApps community that we're building. So Boston College has already done a number of integrations. Their own BC student accounts tool, which is really part of the overarching EagleApps code base, but it was built a little bit differently, and it is integrated with the underlying EagleApps services. They've integrated UAchieve degree audit, obviously activity workflow, which we had a demonstration of a couple of weeks ago, but also with the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a service here in the US for transcript management and federal reporting, and also NELNet, which is a third-party payment and refund processing service. And again, I've already mentioned with planned integrations. So part of an implementation study is going to be looking at what are the systems on your campus that you need to be integrating with to help make EagleApps fit into that environment. And part of that will be the mapping those product capabilities and integration protocols to the EagleApps APIs and identifying how those integrations are going to be built. And again, part of the community model is we're hoping as integrations are developed to more common tools and services and systems that are out there, that those will be shared among the community. So the EagleApps community can then develop its own library of connectors for integration with those sorts of products. Applications and tools. Now we'll get back to the other story. So BC is building a lot of applications on top of EagleApps. And again, we think their selection of tools that they developed are going to be useful to a wide variety of organizations. But as you're going through an implementation study, it may be that new applications will be required. So that's something we'll need to look at. And then how those applications are built, whether we see common requirements across multiple organizations moving forward and can invest in building new applications. Again, it's building applications directly against the EagleApps APIs. Application development is rather more straightforward in the EagleApps environment than in most environments because of the strict adherence to the APIs themselves. So there's a lot of applications to look at for patterns as to how to use those APIs. really a matter of designing the user experience that is needed for those kinds of functionalities and building them. An example that Tom mentioned last week was in our conversations with the Open University of Catalonia, this idea of a user, sort of a workflow type of graphical user interface to help illustrate program requirements was something that was expressed, and sort of this basic wireframe idea for what this would look like was presented. This is the kind of thing that Boston College is not building this tool, but there's no reason the tool couldn't be built on top of the EagleApps APIs. So this is something that you know, if an organization who wanted a tool like this wanted to implement EagleApps, we'd need to look at building out that particular tool to add it to the growing collection of discrete tools that run in the EagleApps environment. So then it becomes part of that collection. And we can imagine other sorts of things. One I wanted to point out that Tom sort of touched on last week that's very interesting to us has to do with degree audit. Boston College has decided to deal with degree audit by integrating with a commercial degree audit system. But EagleApps does have, as part of its underlying service model, very rich services defined for program requirements and requisite management. And it's all rules-based, as Tom, I think, touched on a little bit last week. It allows a person to put together a rich set of logic around what it takes to complete a course requirement or an overall program requirement through rules that actually can be accessed through EagleApps APIs, EagleApps service contracts. So there's no reason why someone couldn't begin to build tools in EagleApps environments that would do degree audit sorts of functionality and start providing that as another set of tools within the EagleApps environment itself. This is something that we think would be a very interesting project, a community project to bring forward and sort of change the way we think about degree audit and really exposing a momentum toward degree in a way that various users of EagleApps could begin to do at will as they needed through the educational and advising process, for instance. So things to think about. Again, these all need to be built into implementation plans for organizations that want to build these kinds of tools or want them to be part of that. And the last thing I'm going to talk about before turning it over to Moon is incremental deployment. We've had a few conversations since we started these sessions with various people who are very intrigued by the idea of incremental deployment. I'm just going to reuse some slides that we used back in March to remind people what this is all about. And in general, it represents the way that Boston College itself has been deploying EagleApps. Taking a system as complex as a student information system and switching it out, whole is obviously a huge task, and a task that needs to happen at certain times during the year. You can't just do it whenever you want. But because of EagleApps' strict adherence to its service contracts and the ability to implement those service contracts against other technologies, gives us sort of new ways to think about how one might deploy EagleApps into an existing environment. One thing one might do is, without even touching EagleApps, implement the EagleApps academic record-based APIs against their legacy system. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure, Tom, if that's what, I think that's part of how the BC implementation worked. basically you look at those elements of the legacy system that support academic record, you implement the APIs, and then you can begin looking at deploying some of the EagleApps applications that deal with academic record on top of that implementation. And then begin to look at how you'd roll out other pieces of the EagleApps service infrastructure. So here's an example of basic canonical course management. Obviously, the legacy system will have management of courses in it. Typically, all the commercial ones do. A plan here would be, for instance, to stand up the EagleApps course management module, and for some period of time, through integrated through a couple different implementations of course management, synchronize that data with the legacy system while you're doing an incremental deployment. Same thing with other sorts of services. So you can imagine various paths through implementing EagleApps where you implement certain things, leave other things in place, synchronize with the existing environment until you finally get to the point where you're maybe in full implementation. You also might decide to stop partway and say, okay, we actually only care about a couple different aspects of EagleApps for now. We're going to let our legacy system deal with everything else. So there's no reason why you couldn't deploy EagleApps and have it side by side for some period of time with a legacy environment. We feel there's a lot of power in this for mitigating a lot of the risks involved with deploying such an important enterprise system for education. So part of the implementation planning for this would be, first of all, which EagleApps components do you want to deploy? At the end of 5 years, do you want to have all of EagleApps, or do you really only want certain pieces of the system, and you're going to leave others to your existing systems? What are the required integrations to support incremental deployment? How are you going to then schedule that deployment based on budget, based on staff availability? How are you going to deal with business model change in the environment, the academic calendars, and so forth? So this will be part of the implementation study, is to come up with the plan for incremental deployment in the implementation plan. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amun.
Quick check, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so we're now going to be getting into the operations and training plan. The operations, next slide. The operations and training plan is focused on compiling the information necessary for a successful deployment at your institution. This will include the specifics of your target environment, whether you're using VMware servers or deploying to AWS. The plan elements will include a breakdown of required roles, recurring operations events, flows and checklists for standard maintenance procedures, and training and support materials for operations staff, the help desk, and end users. You're seeing a lot of this here in some of the sample components that we've outlined. We also plan to gather information about resource usage and optimal deployment configurations over the course of the studies, so that we'll be able to provide some additional information to the communities about what sort of technical layouts work best. Next slide. Next, we're talking about the resource and budget model. So another goal of the implementation is to identify the costs associated with the implementation, deployment, and long-term support of EagleApps. So for your specific school's infrastructure and situation, how many people in which roles will be required to implement and support EagleApps long-term? How much will it cost to identify and hire new resources or backfill current employees during the implementation? It also includes server hosting charges and any tools required by your staff to support the deployment. We hope to build out a fairly robust resource and budget model that can provide detailed information for the specific implementing schools, as well as a more general cost model for use by the larger community. And once again, as you can see here, we're looking to have that broken out in terms of how much does the initial lift cost for that initial implementation, and how much we expect it to cost long-term to have this product as a portion of your constellation of supported services. Next slide. So, we've talked a lot about technical components and the components of the implementation plan itself. We need to talk a moment about who we will need, the people who need to be participants in this study. When it comes to implementation study participants, we're looking for student service veterans with on-the-ground experience after school. We're looking for people who have like a deep understanding of your processes. We're looking for breadth, a wide understanding across the entire student life cycle, as well as depth, understanding both the current practices and the underlying reasons behind them. Tom talked a little bit about this earlier when he was talking about the sort of people that we were looking for when in reviewing particular processes. Ideally, these competencies would exist in as small a set of individuals as possible. We want to avoid a committee of stovepipes. We're looking for those with the ability to look across various functional areas at sufficient detail to understand how an implementation can become viable for your school. Now, one thing we do need to talk about is the time allocation that we're expecting around this for those participants. Our current expectation is that participation will occur on an irregular schedule over at least 6 months, and we anticipate needing no more than 50% of a participant's time over that duration. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Next slide. All this work is required to help build out this master map that you see here of the processes for your school, as well as providing the detailed plans and guides to deploy and support EagleApps. Next slide. You won't be alone in this though. The role of DXtera will be to manage and support this process. This will include facilitating the various implementation study events, hosting and supporting the online community, and performing additional supporting analyses to test and validate the outcomes of the design sessions. In the end, each school involved in the study will be provided an implementation packet that will include all the elements that we've been outlining today. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Dale.
Dale.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pull my screen back up as well. So thanks to Jeff, Tom, and Amun for going into detail on the implementation studies. And again, they are extensive proposed studies that we will be engaged with a few institutions at a time beginning in this next quarter. We have been engaged in conversations with some institutions who are very interested in stepping into this role. And so we're eager to invite others to be a part of these discussions. Again, a reminder of the community, what we are focused on doing and asking you to join and inviting you to join. Just to bring in, I added one point here, which is in addition to everything I saw before, was access to DXtera solutions is part of this as well. One of the pieces that comes up is what is the expectation for investment? We talked about our model of community and how it works. The model we are rolling out with this and this invitation is that folks join the community at a $15,000 a year commitment level. That's a way to support the activity and shared progress forward, and is consistent with the membership model within DXtera. And the second is the implementation study to get that everything that was just proposed and rolled out is a $200,000 commitment for that first cycle. And then ongoing discussions through the collective effort will determine next phase investments in that. One thing you will find as a shared community and nonprofit consortium, we are extremely transparent in both designing, developing, and communicating the types of investment we think is necessary to move these things forward. With that, I'd like to turn it to see if there are any questions and answers that come in from folks. I know throughout this discussion, a very thorough and logical and organized discussion, there has not been many questions and answers, but I want to pause to see if there is any that come in now one last time. And again, thank you to our colleagues from both Europe and the States who have joined today. All of the sessions are available as recorded webinars off of the DXtera site, DXtera, and then an EagleApps page therein. Want to thank our colleagues from Boston College and across DXtera who have joined in and participating in these sessions. The one thing I will say, I didn't mention on the community slide, is we are proposing our first EagleApps community meeting for the 4th of June. And we would set that at a similar time as this, probably late Eastern time zone, United States, for the morning, so that our colleagues in Europe would be able to synchronously participate as well. And let me just double check. No other questions have come in. So with that, would like to say thank you to everyone who has attended today. You can always email us directly at EagleApps@DXtera.org. Any questions, comments, or additional interest, we will send out a direct email to everyone who has participated in any of these sessions to ask for your continued engagement, invite you to join the community, and become leaders in this effort to deploy and scale a next generation campus system. Thank you all for attending today. We hope you have a great day.